This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Robert and I are delighted to be joined by Emma Darwin today. And for a few more episodes coming, Emma is helping us fill in while Kathryn is on maternity leave. Emma's debut novel, The Mathematics of Love, is possibly the only novel ever nominated for both the Commonwealth Writers' Best First Book and RNA Romantic Novel of the Year awards. Her next novel, A Secret Alchemy, was a Sunday Times bestseller. Her blog, This Itch of Writing, gave rise to Get Started in Writing Historical Fiction and her memoir, This Is Not a Book About Charles Darwin, A Writer's Journey Through My Family, which is forthcoming in 2019. She mentors and tutors writers and has a PhD in creative writing. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Alida.
You are welcome.
Robert.
So let's get to know you a little bit. You're a writer of historical fiction. We're going to call this episode part of our genre series. So what first drew you to historical fiction as opposed to any other genre or literary or contemporary fiction? Why historical?
Well, I sort of fell into it. I'm one of those writers who has loads of novels under the bed
Yes.
before I got published. Yeah. And the first two or three were not historical. They were pretty much the here and now. And then the third one I wrote, it came out a bit short. It was looking a bit skimpy, and it was about a family, which was a family business, and it imploded, dramatically. That was the story. But I realized that in order to make the reader mind, we needed to know why it was sad, not just that these people were unhappy, but that something had been ruined by someone who was trying to save it. They'd ruined it instead. And so I put in some diary entries from the grandmother of the family, just setting out, just touching in the past of this business, how it had been established and all the rest of it. And of course I had to do a little bit of research and think about things in the longer time. And as I wrote those diary entries, I just had this enormous sense of coming home as a writer. It was it's like it must be like that when someone gave Tiger Woods his first golf club, or something like that.
Right.
Just that, of course, and then of course I looked back and I realized that all the fiction I'd loved as a child was historical. It was Rosemary Sutcliffe, it was Cynthia Harnett, it was Geoffrey Treece. It was and then actually as a late teen, well, first of all, I discovered Georgia Hare, who I adore, though I don't read anything else like that but her, and practically know by heart. And then just as I was doing that thing you do in adolescence, particularly if you're the age where YA hadn't been invented, there was this sort of gap.
Right.
Francis Spufford had a very fascinating memoir he wrote called The Boy That Books Built, or The Child That Books Built. He talks about this. He's about my age, and he talks about this gap when you've kind of grown out of the children's stuff. It's a little bit too young for you, but the equivalent of fabulous, brilliant, genius children's stuff in adult literature is a bit too hard. It's too hard and it's too slippery. You don't know who to root for. You don't know quite what the book's trying to do.
Right.
And he talks about what a lot of keen readers at that age, they go into genre. They discover the genre adult stuff. And that, for me, that was Hare. And then Peter Ackroyd came along. People like Peter Ackroyd, John Fowles, that generation who were doing complicated, interesting historical fiction that took a bit of reading, William Golding. And so I discovered grown-up historical fiction, and everything sort of fell into place. And I thought, oh, yes, of course I should be writing this.
Right.
I don't care about writing London in 1980, whatever it was. Of course I should. And so the next thing was more historical, and on I went. And then I was getting very encouraging rejections from agents I was sending it to, but they weren't biting. And up until then, I'd always known. I'd always kind of got to the end of a project and kind of known what I'd failed at. sort of been able to see what I hadn't done that I should do next. And then I thought, I don't know how to get over that last hump. It's the first time I don't know what this needs. So I did a master's. Mm-hmm. And at the time, it was the only whole book masters. It was an MPhil. It was the only one in Britain where you did a whole novel, which is what I wanted to do. I knew I could write a novel. I just needed somebody to give me that external perspective. And so I spent a year writing this novel with a wonderful workshop of 8 of my fellows and 8 tutors. It's an extraordinary.
Wow.
Now at the University of South Wales. And that was the novel that got me an agent, and then she sold it really quickly. And it wasn't at that stage called The Mathematics of Love, but that's what it became. Nice. And after that, I thought, well, obviously, because actually, when I walk out of this door, I see history. It's just how I was always going to be a historian until I was 16. I wasn't going to be a writer. I was going to be a historian, and I'm looking out of my window now, and I know that those are Victorian houses, and the road is called after the farm that the Victorian houses were built on this suburb of London, and the railways came, it's just how I experience it. So, of course, my fiction's like that, if you know what I mean. And often it does have feet in 2 different times. The Mathematics of Love does it.
Right,
often it's 1976, which my daughter thinks is extremely historical.
Of course, yes.
And half of it is set in 1819, just after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Because again, that embodies my feeling that under my feet, the time is under my feet, and it's all around me, and the veil, but it's almost a ghost story, just not quite.
Yeah.
Because the veil between times feels to me very thin.
Yes. Yeah. I love how your passion and interests have driven this entire journey, your creative arc. Yeah, you said something I
think it's wise to look at what's natural to you, because you're almost certain to be able to exploit it better. You still have to exploit it, make the most of it. But you're always going to be able to do that than something that's just completely externally imposed. My heart sinks when I get a student who said, I want to be a writer, so I've gone and looked at what's selling, and now I'm going to write one of those.
Yeah.
Yes. It does work. It can work.
It can work, yeah.
But actually, in the middle, if it does work, 9 times out of 10, either they actually naturally were kind of built for a thriller writer, even though they didn't know it, as it were, or they have the gift of being able to cultivate a passion for something that maybe they hadn't known.
Yeah. Yes,
but
I'm glad you said that.
Sorry.
Maybe like yourself, there was that sort of big gap between where you started and then looping back to it. So it's you do come back and find that love. I never thought I'd be a writer at all, and I just love the idea of story, and I didn't realise that can lend itself to being a good writer actually if story is your first love. What is the allure of historical fiction to you, both as a reader and a writer? What is it you think that grabs people?
I think it's one important part is in a way it's the sibling of the allure of speculative fiction of fantasy and sci-fi and steampunk and all those is that it's other. It is by definition an other world.
Right.
I mean, when we're all wrangling about what counts as historical fiction and doesn't, I think for the purposes of the writer, the important definition is Margaret Atwood's, and she talks. It's a very, very fascinating essay about writing Alias Grace, which is actually going to be a movie any minute, I think, isn't it? I'll send you the link. It was done as a speech, but it's available to read, and she defines historical fiction as fiction written before the writer came to consciousness.
Yeah.
Which on the one hand is complicated because obviously that's a different boundary if you're 80 from if you're 18.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, in terms of what the job is for the writer, that's the crucial thing, is you are setting your fiction in a time that you cannot have experienced directly.
Right, and then you're dependent on research and imagination and building scenarios around things that you have no personal experience with, and it's a totally different process.
Totally different
from
process.
writing
and you
contemporary
have to do the
fiction.
Exactly.
Oh,
and
very
you have
much.
to do the world building thing the way that the fantasy writers and the sci-fi writers do, and but also you have to find, as you say, you have to find it in yourself to reimagine stuff that you were not there for. Even writing 1976 for a 16-year-old, actually, I was 12. And it was partly because, it had been a few years since, but I also, and she was a very different character, but I had to do a bit of research to dig up what pop posters she would have had on her wall. It's always surprisingly difficult to find out about prices, what things cost. I kept sort of collaring my grandparents and saying, what would you have paid for, how much was a packet of crisps, a can of Coke, except it wasn't a can, it was a bottle, or whatever, that kind of thing.
And we were fairly fresh into decimal as well at that point.
We were fairly fresh into decimal, and my own personal trajectory is complicated because we moved to New York when I was 3, to Manhattan, and we came back when I was 6, and in 1970, and I don't remember London before we left. My first memories are actually Manhattan.
Okay.
And to me, coming back to London wasn't home like my parents felt it was, or my older sister, but was actually the new place. And I remember my older sister having a discussion with my mother about whether I should be taught pounds, shillings, and pence. Because I was just the age when children learn to wrangle money, and I could do set dollars and cents, which was what I'd been doing in my school in New York.
Exactly.
But we were about to go decimal, and particularly pounds, shillings, and pence. My older sister is actually now a mathematician.
Nice.
Pounds, shillings, and pence is particularly mad maths. And so it was decided, as it were, that I wouldn't learn that, and I would just learn pounds. I mean, that's a measure of how complicated our relationship is to the stuff
to the past.
Right.
So is that what you find fascinating then when you're writing that historical, the transportation into the other? Is that part of the allure for you? The sort of reaching back into how did we think back then?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, one of the things I did in the book I was commissioned to write, Get Started in Writing Historical Fiction, was I actually started with a chapter that says, why do you want to write historical fiction? And it wasn't really to psychoanalyze the reader. It was actually because thinking about, why are you going to go to the extra trouble? Does make a difference to how you write it. It makes a difference to what I often talk with writers I'm mentoring. I talk about what's your project. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to do and think and explore, and what world are you trying to create? And what world you're trying to create is going to be shaped by why you're bothering, and why the reader's bothering to read it, and so on. And so, is it because you want to bring the past alive for a reason, an important piece of past, a fascinating piece of past? Is it actually because you want to say something about now, and like with someone like, The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood is actually really importantly really trying to say something about now, and to the point where she said that everything she puts in there, all the restrictions on the women, are live and kicking somewhere in the world now. That's part of her point. She's just sort of brought them all together into a wholly imagined world. Also, let's face it, it's fun. All those frocks.
Yes, it is fun.
All those frocks. All those horses. I do love writing a hawking scene. And interestingly, I think there's that. There is the romance. There's the otherness. There is it can be about exploring both what's contingent, to your particular circumstances, anybody's. There are things about the which are not like now,
right?
And things about the past which are exactly like now. I mean, love is much the same.
Yes,
it's very much the same. What is it that drives people? And so you're very often in a strange way by taking those drives and putting them somewhere else from our world. They don't get embroiled in the particularities of now. Again, that in that essay by Alias Grace, Margaret Atwood, she talks about, I'm going to get this wrong now, she talks about, I'll have to check it, a novel by, I think she's called Margaret Lawrenson, and I think it's called The Stone Angel, but I'll have to check that. which is about an old woman, and she said Canadians think it's about their grandmother, and United States Americans think it's about an old woman they know, and Europeans think it's about old age. So the more distant you are from something, the more you see the less you get in on the kind of particular details, and the more you see the big issues. Or you could home in on a particular thing. Rose Tremaine talks about writing restoration in the middle of the big sort of 1980s explosion of money and yuppies and the deregulation of all the financial stuff, so that suddenly there were a lot of people with extraordinary amounts of money. And she wanted to write about that, but she didn't want to write about that particular world. So she wrote Restoration, in which sex is the currency in the way that wadges of £50 notes were in 80s City of London banking world. And so that was not so much about the general stuff as about a very particular, a sort of allegorical version almost of a very particular time.
Yeah, it's interesting. All of these references really are bringing to mind how much theme drives content, because writers have a purpose in writing a particular story and setting it in a particular place and time, or going to one genre over another. And what we're really getting at here is the why that's driving the writer, our personal motivation for doing this story in this way.
Why this, not all the others. And I think it's incredibly important. And I think very often when you're in a muddle, you're going back to that why. Or I mean, I sort of, what are you trying to do? I do think it's not necessarily that you can't start till you know that. I do think very often it emerges. It could start with an interesting person or a place or an event, particularly historical fiction. You can get fascinated by an event.
Yes.
Or a period. And I think it may only emerge what you're
as
really
you're writing.
Up to.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to realize that The Mathematics of Love was really about lost children.
Right.
I knew it was about voyeurism right from the start, because I knew it was going to be about photography, which is one of my recurring obsessions.
Right.
And I knew that, but I hadn't realized that it was going to be about lost children, both sort of physically and mentally. It's not really a ghost story, but there's a child who just possibly sort of might be, because he's the most lost. He's so lost because of how he's not looked after. That maybe he's not even properly anchored in his own time. I don't actually believe in ghosts, but I think they're a very interesting embodiment of a lot that we experience about people, about other people.
Yeah.
So I think I didn't know that until I was well into the first draft, and was having it workshopped on the masters. So it had reading it, talking about it. I wasn't just shut in my room, splurging stuff on the page. I was having to roughly tidy up chunks, so sort of slap them into shape, as it were, in order to have them workshopped and have my tutor look at them. And so I made a big note. This is about lost children, and from then on, encouraged that to emerge. And when I went back to revise the whole thing, went back to the bits where I hadn't known that and encouraged it a bit more. But I think almost anything that people say you need to, that you need for a book, I think you don't necessarily need it at the beginning of the work.
Right.
You may, but you don't have to.
The more pre-writing and developmental work you can do, the better set you are to get all those wheels turning and things flowing. But you absolutely don't need. I don't think you can have all of it at the beginning.
And I also think it comes with experience. I mean, I now can, plan out plots because I've just done a lot of plot spinning.
Right.
But I couldn't before, and I don't think either.
True.
I don't think that was my mistake then, and I don't think it's my mistake now. In a way, it's just that now I can. Now it used to be, now I can look at a synopsis or a plan, and it's like a doctor looking at an X-ray. They don't just see the bones; they see all the subtle details of the flesh, and they can kind of see the person.
Yep.
And I'm sure an experienced, radiographer could recognize at least a naked person from their X-ray, from the shape and the proportions and the flesh.
Yes.
But when you first see an X-ray ever in your life, all you see is bones, and everybody's bones are the same, and it's can't see any differences at all. So I often say that anything that someone tells you is a planning tool can also be a sorting out tool later.
Oh, absolutely. I always use my storyboards to get started, and then again when I'm revising as kind of that blueprint to what I'm doing. And am I going off course, and do I want to revise the blueprint because this is a really great discovery, or do I want to get that story back to the blueprint and
absolutely.
Keep working with it?
And I think that's true, and particularly if you are a kind of splurgy, shitty first draft merchant, you don't know what you've got. How do I know what I think till I see what I say? Then very often, and things like sketch maps and all sorts. I work a lot now with students with getting them to write synopses. Not the selling one you're going to send off with your chapters to an agent, but particularly because having to turn things into sentences, I think is really useful. And I mean, I'm a bit of a planner, and I love charts and diagrams and maps and all sorts of stuff as a way of thinking. I think with my pen in my hand, as it were. And then at some point, my agent, I think might have been for Secret Alchemy, said, can you give me a sense of the whole thing? Could you write me a synopsis? So I sat down with a sigh and tried to write a synopsis, and discovered that actually my second half plot did not hitch up. It just didn't have a proper causal, one thing did not lead to another in the most basic sense of engineering. And all my charts and grids had not revealed that to me. It was only when I had to make a sentence, because a sentence is a chain, and then it obviously has a hook to the next sentence. It was only when I tried to do it that way that I realized it couldn't be done.
Yes.
So I work with synopses quite a lot, and particularly with when you're working with historical fiction, a lot of novels, including my own, have more than one timeline. Whether there's a huge gap of century or three, or whether it's there's two different things. There's somebody old when they're young, or whatever. I mean, it's common in other kinds of fiction as well, but I think anyone working in historical fiction is very conscious of time, and that and that lures us into that kind of thing, and that's where planning and synopses and getting the synopsis to express the way we move between the two, I think can be really useful. However much we all groan.
Well, I think
that's interesting.
I think when you're writing historical fiction, there's more of a tendency to be conscious of time and to want to maybe play with time, do those jumps or those shifts, perhaps because we're relating to a time other than our own. And if you're writing something like a thriller, you've got that ticking clock convention, and so everything is very like rush to the finish, in a chronology that's very tight and compact. When you're talking about generations or centuries or decades in someone's life, there is that fluidity of perspective, I think, with time, and these tools become essential to understanding what we're trying to do and how we're going to communicate it to a reader without creating confusion. I do a lot of spreadsheets of ages and things like that. I mean, partly just because you could do fill series and get everybody's age from birth to death sorted, which does make life easier. I think there's always a risk, because we do love our history, and because we are very conscious of that that we're just taking a slice out of the years that go on. I think there's always a risk that you try and cover too much ground. I mean, there's no law that says you can't write a novel that's set on one day. And particularly when the project is a real historical character and you've got a whole life to grapple with, the temptation to make it a sort of a biography with some costumes, conversation plonked in, is enormous, and it very rarely works. I think it's very difficult to make work. I mean, bring up
Bring Up the Bodies, Hilary Mantel's second Thomas Cromwell one, it covers about 6 weeks, as far as I remember.
Right.
And even when when Wolf Hall covers the first part of his life, she's extremely selective about what she puts in.
Yeah.
And it's still a very long book. I mean, I think it's a fabulous book. But I think I think it might be Steven Pinker actually talking about scholarly writing, but he talks about the curse of knowledge, when all that stuff in your head, you'll just absolutely so want to get on the page.
Yes. Yeah.
And I spend a lot of time with students and mentees talking about what's missing, but I spend even more time talking about what doesn't need to be in there.
Well, they should be putting on the cutting room floor.
Your story.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah. And the one telling detail, it's always going to be better than half a page of architectural description.
Exactly. Yeah, and I like to remind writers of the workload they're creating for themselves. If, like in Saving Annabelle, the story covers about 12 years, and there's a gap in the middle. So there's the 1860s period and the 1870s period with this gap in the middle, and it really doubled my research because fashion changed over those 12 years. The town grew, new people moved in, people left, so the character development and the research and such. And so if it's essential to your story, if that is the story you need to tell, then it's worth doing that effort. But when you're writing something so expansive, or 5 points of view, or do you really want to do that?
Yes. And also, I think, as well as just the sheer legwork, there is also the risk that the research material becomes our darlings. We love it, we adore it, and it cost us a lot. So in it goes. I think there's also the way with that kind of thing, when you're covering a long period, that it's actually a function of the fact that it takes longer to write a book than to read it. And you're much, much slower. And so you feel as if it's ages since you dropped in, say, with your time gap in that one.
Right.
It's ages since you dropped in the fact that the clothes have changed enormously, and now she can't, her skirts have got so wide in her
skirts have gone from circles to ovals.
So exactly. In you go with that. And then the reader actually gets, for the last time you mentioned the fact that now the carriages are all open or whatever it is, some other embodiment of the time. And the reader actually read the last one about half an hour ago and feels very hit over the head by what feels to them like your insistence on the historical process. You wrote 8 weeks apart and you haven't got that sense.
Yes. Do I have to watch her get dressed again?
Yes. Yes. So clothes are fun. I mean, going back to why people do it, I think the other reason we do it is voice and language. And again, A.S. Byatt has a nice point, which she tried and I tried to track down, but she said she read an interview by a journalist called Chris Peachment with 4 writers. She said, I think it was John Fowles, Graham Swift, and a couple of others. And she says she hasn't been able to track it down and find out who it is. So I can't do my proper referencing thing either.
Right.
But the interviewer asked them all, why it was Ackroyd as well. It was that turn in the 80s towards historical fiction when good literary fiction up until then had been all about the problems of the present day and political and either sort of satirical, social, or very serious. But either way, it was all about now, and that's what proper literature should be doing. And suddenly, Peter Ackroyd's writing Hawksmoor. And John Fowles is writing The French Lieutenant's Woman, and it's not about today in the obvious literal sense at all. And the interviewer asked them all why they were doing this, and expecting something about, a way of looking at today through the lens of another world and all the rest of it. And what they said was, we want to write long sentences. Because what they wanted was they wanted the vocal freedom, if you like. They wanted the capacity to play, to use
language,
non-contemporary vocabulary. I love a good, well-built long sentence, and I love the fact that Stephen Fairhurst, my 1819 guy who is a veteran of Waterloo. I love the fact that his sentences have a different structure from my pissed off teenager in
Yes.
six. I mean, they both talk long sentences, but his have more of a form and a structure, and hers just kind of lollop along and. And I love both. I love writing Stephen, and I also love the fact that you can play with the contrast of voice.
Yeah,
and that's
absolutely
part of how the time is embodied. I think
critical.
every writer, it is critical. Every writer sort of makes their own decisions about it. I mean, you can from Paul Kingsnorth, The Wake, which is written in as close to Anglo-Saxon. It's about the 1066 from the Anglo-Saxon point of view, and it's about Hereward the Wake, in other words. And he writes, he's created what he calls a shadow tongue, which is as close as he can get to the Anglo-Saxon area while still being comprehensible.
Right.
Which it is, particularly if you read it aloud. It is deeply fascinating to do. Not everybody wants to do that. I pride myself that I write a very mean Paston letter. The Paston letters are the great treasure trove of letters from late 15th century. Wars of the Roses date, which I draw on a lot for A Secret Alchemy. And I could write a pretty good parody Paston letter, but you couldn't. It would be very, very hard going for most readers to read it like that. And that's only 100 years before Shakespeare. And even then you find things like family means your whole household, including all your servants. But much trickier things like, and I'm now not going to quote them right, but some words have come to have the exact opposite of what they mean now.
Yes. Yes.
So you can't be authentic. I think authenticity is a real trap and a chimera for historical fiction writers. Actually, it's not possible.
That's true.
You have to make your own decisions about it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
yes.
It is
Otherwise
interesting.
It would just become difficult for a reader to read it.
Yeah, either it's difficult for a reader, and also it just leads you down a kind of very sterile alley of
yes.
What am I allowed to do or not? The answer is you're allowed to do anything. It's your book. It's your rules.
Yes.
Right. Right. It is interesting too what we as writers think is completely obvious, and then what trips up readers. I have a medieval era story, and I talk about the dirty kale on the man's head, and a kale is just sort of a linen cap that they use to keep the dirt out of their hair because they didn't bathe that often. And kale is a foreign word to us, but if it's sitting on his head, it's a cap, it's a hat. It's okay, fine, right?
Right,
the word tripped up so many people. Well, what's a kale? I'm like, well, it's the thing on his head. Did I not give you context? It's like, oh wow.
It's just different. And I think you can't actually cover every possible reaction to that.
No.
Particularly partly because people have different amounts of knowledge, but also I think because they're reading with different amounts of attention. We all scoot through a thriller on the tube, on the train, or read tired in the bath, and with a different quality of attention from something that we're really deeply sunk into. But also I think people vary a lot in how much they mind not knowing.
Yes. Yeah, that's
some
true.
people will just sort of think, oh, a head thing, and kind of keep going, and other people will get very bothered by not knowing. They need to feel that the world under their feet, as it were, except it's on his head, is solid, and they can't easily move on. And you can't legislate for every possible reader like that. You can only do your best. And I think it's where your beta readers come in, actually, as well. You can't, I mean, it's one of the functions of Facebook, actually. Admittedly, a lot of my Facebook friends are writers, but not all of them are. But also, even writers have any amount of different levels of knowledge. Is to sort of stick something up there and say, would you, who would know what I meant? And by the way, please don't say what it is while I get a good perspective on how how many people know, and that could be or Twitter.
Yes.
That could be a good way of just checking and seeing if you're roughly in the right territory.
Yeah, that's a good tip for all genre writers. This piece of magic or technology or history. Who gets this sentence? Or
if you're relatively, I mean, I grew up without a TV, so I haven't seen all the classic movies that the BBC used to be able to afford to put on a rainy Saturday afternoon.
Right.
I've caught up with some. But I'm still missing quite a lot of that. And so I will not get film references often that other people will. And so I'm quite a good test for a mentee or someone who hasn't given the reader quite enough help to understand. Because you've got to understand the significance. I mean, with your hat thing, your head covering, tail, it's interesting because you need to know what it's for, even if you've never heard it before. And it sounds as if you did, actually, but obviously some people didn't get it.
Right. I think we need to wrap this up. Yeah. This is such a fascinating discussion, though.
It's great. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Robert or Emma, as we close up this episode?
No, there's a lot to learn.
There's a lot to take in. Let me just remind everybody that Kathryn...
I might put one thought in, actually, thinking about it, because I said it's your book, your rules. But I also think that it is your book, your rules, but it's really helpful to make some rules for yourself about how historical your voices roughly want to be or don't, about how much you can bend or break the actual historical facts, because you can do anything, but it saves you having to reinvent the wheel every time and think, can I do this? Can I not? Also, I think readers sense if there's a sort of the relationship of your novel to the real historical stuff, if that's consistent. I think readers pick it up on it. They may not know they are, but I think they do.
Absolutely.
And it makes it easier and it makes it work better. So your book, your rules, but make some.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah, you can do anything you want so long as you do it well. If you do it well, it'll be well received, and if you don't do it well, it didn't work, and the book is going to flop. So
and help the reader, particularly in the early bit of the book, the early first few chapters, help the reader to learn your rules, help the reader to understand how this story is being told, and what this world is like, and how it runs, and how it relates to the history that they do know. There are a couple of posts on my blog about that, about helping the reader, teaching the reader to read your book, because readers are very, very open and malleable at the beginning.
Yes.
But once they've found out how this book works, as it were, then they will get quite antsy and uncomfortable if you then
change it up
your book.
Exactly.
If it stops working like that, it's like on stage. If you've got very, very realistic, naturalistic world going on, if suddenly somebody does a magic spell in Act 3, the audience they're going to start
take it,
and not like it. You've got to set it up that this is a world that magic can happen in, or this is a world that we can laugh at people getting their hearts broken.
Yes, it's all about continuity.
If it's farce, as opposed to a tragedy. So I think that's worth thinking about. It's another reason for making your rule book, because then you know what you're going to need to help your reader to understand.
And what you need to put in the orientation part of the book.
In that early bit where they're very, very open to absorbing the rules, but they will be absorbing rules, so make sure they're the rules you want them to absorb.
Right, absolutely. Wonderful note to end on. So let me just remind listeners that we do have show notes, and Kathryn puts timestamps for everything, so she'll list kind of what we were talking about and what minute it's at. So if you want to revisit some part of this discussion specifically, or just kind of get like a table of contents, go to storyworkspodcast.com. Also, we will link to all the stuff we mentioned. Kathryn, you're going to be busy with this episode.
She's busy. Thank you, Kathryn.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. I'll send you the links.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.